Okay, I'm gonna admit. All right.
Thank you. Bye. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for coming to today's Thursday session of the SADC TFCA webinars. Today, it's a deep learning session as usual, and we're going to talk about managing complexity in transfrontier conservation areas. In welcoming you all, I would like to remind you to please keep your microphone muted unless you are about to do an intervention. Also use the chat box of the Zoom tool to insert your details, your institutional details, and also use them to share your experiences and comments and ask questions. I would like to remind you that this is a deep learning session, so we have moderators and experts because these are the people that we've identified as important to drive the conversation forward, but you're all welcome to intervene and share your experiences as professionals in the field. So without much further ado, I would like to invite the two moderators for today to show their video and unmute themselves. We have Professor Ettingen Diwa as an ecologist and also the Dean of the School of Wildlife Ecology and Conservation at Chinoy University of Technology. And Mr. Michael Murphy, who is the Program Manager of the KEFA program for WWF South Africa, which is a USAID funded project on experimenting on alternative no-law enforcement solutions to wildlife crimes in the South Africa-Mozambique landscape. Thank you, everybody, for joining us, and thank you to the moderators. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Clara. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this webinar on managing complexity in SADC TFCAs. I will, at this juncture, introduce our two experts for today. So the first is Richard Digu. He is with WWF CBNRM, or a business lead for the Communal Conservancy Program in Namibia. A brief about Richard. Richard has extensive experience in CBNRM from the early 1990s in the Campfire program in Zimbabwe. He worked for the Muzarabani Rural District Council. To date, he has 22 years with the Namibian Conservancy, which is under the Namibia Community Conservancies, first with the Integrated Rural Development and Nature Conservation, abbreviated as IRDNC, in the Zambezi Caprivi region, and subsequently with WWF in the Namibia office. Richard has a diverse background, having worked in the private banking sector in England and Germany prior to engaging in community conservation and development. Our second expert for this webinar is Pete Theron. He is the International Coordinator for the TFCA, the Great Limpopo Transfrontier Conservation Area. Pete is a landscape architect working in the environmental planning and management field. Pete has more than 24 years experience working on a wide range of natural resource management and social development projects in Southern Africa. He has been closely involved in the planning, development, and implementation of 5 transfrontier conservation areas projects in Southern Africa, which necessitates setting up collaborative networks and forums between a variety of diverse sectors, including the safety and security cluster, tourism sector, conservation agencies, and rural communities. So with these two, we can actually see the rich experience, diverse, backgrounds, which will basically, help us in unpacking the topic of complexity that we will be discussing in this webinar. So for Richard, just as a personal, experience, he is one of those colleagues who have actually, shaped the Campfire, model that, Zimbabwe has been pioneered, and which, to us, particularly those from Zimbabwe, we have actually, benefited and actually, worked to see it grow to where it is today. Pete, I have actually, had an opportunity to work with him whilst I was still under Zimpact as an ecologist in Bonara National Park. He brings in a wealth of experience, which will also be able to help us, unpick the topic we have this afternoon. with that introduction of our experts, I would like to pass on the word to Michael to start the discussion.
Thank you very much, Edson, for that introduction, and also to our two colleagues who are the discussants today, both of them well experienced and good friends to both of us, but also to many of the people that are here on this particular webinar today. I would like to get the ball rolling, Richard, with a question to you. I think a lot of people on the call today will have had some interface or experience with community-based approaches in one form or another. Certainly, people here will have seen the literature and be aware of some of the fundamental underlying principles that are involved in community-based approaches. We're also somewhat aware that these community-based approaches occur within a certain degree of complexities in the landscapes in which they're implemented. So my question to you is based on your experience from the Namibian experience in Zambezi province and elsewhere, but also your experience with Campfire and other programs across the region. What do you see as some of these critical complexities that influence the success or challenges in implementing community-based approaches to natural resource management?
So yeah, first of all, good afternoon to everyone, and it's great to be on this webinar series. Mike, before perhaps jumping into the complexities, perhaps, let me reflect on the structures, the framework that we're working in, and then unpack some of the challenges we've got. Now, I'll make reference to the Namibian program. I know that quite well. It's been running for close to 30 years, with the legislation having been passed in 1996 that has empowered rural communities to take responsibility for wildlife. So I think the first really important point there is getting a legislation and having a national program that has enshrined the rights of those communities that can be defended in a court of law if necessary. So I think that's really important. Secondly, these rights are not just about the benefits that have been given. These rights are about responsibilities that have been given to communities to also manage the wildlife, to take responsibility for human-wildlife conflict, to look after the wildlife and protect it. And I think that's also another very important component of a CBNRM, as opposed to just thinking it's about just benefiting it and just getting returns and meat. I think another element that has been really important for the Namibian context has been that these are community bodies that have self-defined themselves in terms of who should be or what area they should cover in terms of their rights base, the structure of the membership. They have their own constitution. These aren't other kind of structured governance bodies that might form part of regional council, for example, in Zimbabwe. They are their own legal entity, guided by the constitution, guided by the AGMs, and I think that's been really also important. And they have identified their own areas to manage. I think what is also been really important for the Namibian perspective is not only do we have the legislation in place, but we've also got the political will pursue and support and uphold that legislation. And I have seen in some other countries that, or I've heard that legislation is very good at times, but if there isn't the political will to support that, then it makes it much more difficult to see a strong, robust CBNRM program. Another aspect that has certainly favored us in Namibia has been the combination of stability over a long period and very valuable resources in terms of the wildlife that have been granted or devolved to the communities, that allows them to unlock the value and provide a fee that goes towards paying the costs of conservation, as well as other opportunities that come from entering into partnerships, business partnerships, tourism, and in our case, hunting as well, where there's job opportunities as well. And so to have the rights over a valuable resource has also really ensured, in the Namibia case, a very robust program. And hence, what we can see now in Namibia is over 83 civil society structures, which we call conservancies, but they are civil societies, self-defined constitutions that cover nearly 20% of Namibia, where they're having the ability to enter into numerous partnerships, over 100 right now, although we've got a bit of a challenge with COVID-19, but if in a normal environment, over 100 businesses are there, lots of jobs, and we've got wildlife recovery. And I think it's based on those tenets of good legislation, political will, the rights and responsibilities being granted down to the lowest levels of community structures, and a rich resource base. So that's perhaps some of the strengths in the program. That's and certainly for us, we have a good framework. But I would still say we're only half full. There's still a lot of challenges that we are facing, and this is where we can perhaps look into the complexity of what do we mean by CBNRM, and just a couple of reflections on that to provide an example is what do we mean by rights, and to understand and unpack that. Is it rights of use? Do you have rights of exclusion? Do you have rights of commercial rights, or is it just subsistence rights? Do you have rights for taking responsibility? Do you even have rights to enforce and to protect the resource base that has been given to you? And there are often mismatches where when we talk about communities, there are different levels that we don't necessarily unpack. You have traditional authorities, you have different groupings, you have committees, you have members, you have villages, you have interest groups. And if we don't carefully understand who's been given the rights, who's got the authority, who can enforce them, we can run into trouble. And another example, and it's clearly one we're grappling with in Namibia, is the legal rights have been granted to a conservancy committee. However, the accountability of when things are wrong is taken by the membership. So it's not the committee that's held accountable, it's the membership through the loss of the rights. And we haven't yet, this is where we're finding a little bit of a challenge in terms of getting our governance right. Another complexity in our program is what are we managing? There's the commercial aspect, there's a conservation aspect. When I say we, I meant it from the community perspective, and then there's the community consideration, and they often need different scales, and certainly with some of the experience we found in Namibia, the commercial and conservation requirements, management units often have to be scaled up. But what that means then is you move away from your communities. And when I talk about communities, I'm not talking about representative structures. I'm talking about participation of individuals, of villages, having a stake beyond just electing a member and possibly going to an AGM. For example, in the early days of our program, it started off with villages selecting game guards. And we found in those times, the villages were much more involved in conservation and engagement than they are today, when that responsibility is left to a committee behind a closed door. And so in some respects, what we're experiencing in Namibia anyway, is that the C in CBNRM has become committee and is no longer really community. When we think about community as village structures that can come together under the tree and collectively get involved in conservation. So those are some of the challenges, complexities that, despite I think a great framework that the Namibian government has provided and a lot of investment and support in Namibia, we still got a lot of work to do. So I'll end there, I think, Mike.
Thanks, Richard. I'll turn it over to Edson. I think Edson's going to pick up with Pete on a couple of issues as well. But thanks for that very good response to that question. Thanks, Richard. Edson, you're on mute.
I would like now to turn, to biodiversity and landscapes, and Pete, bring you in there. Particularly, when we look at complexity in TFCAs, it is also about wildlife management. So how does one address the complications raised by animal movements outside of protected areas and across borders?
Yeah, good afternoon, colleagues. Thanks, Edson and Mike, for the introduction. And yeah, it's a big pleasure to be part of this very exciting webinar series. So, from a GLTFCA perspective, just to give you a brief background. So the GLTFCA is essentially was constructed as a two-phase approach. So we've got a core area, which essentially is Limpopo National Park in Mozambique, Kruger National Park in South Africa, and Gonarozo National Park in Zimbabwe, with a link between Kruger and Gonarozo called the Sengweche Peace Corridor. And then the treaty talks about establishment of a broader area. So we essentially now, which we call the Trans-Frontier Conservation Area. So we essentially started consolidating the core and trying to get the core more operational from a wildlife management, conservation management, and a beneficiation point of view. And now we're looking at establishing a broader conservation landscape, which includes other national parks, for instance, in Mozambique, privately managed areas, community managed areas. So it's a different variety of land users and management regimes in the landscape. So essentially what we're doing from a wildlife management perspective or conservation management perspective is we historically started with active wildlife translocation. So we used to take animals, for instance, from Kruger National Park into Mozambique and start restocking, for instance, Limpopo National Park. And it's sort of a twofold objective. The one is to obviously restore the park and restore the ecological attributes of the park, and then also looking at basically building up some sort of a tourism product. And we also at that time basically started looking at dropping of fences. So we thought, you know, if you drop fences, it's more of a passive way of looking at wildlife moving across boundaries, because one of the treaty objectives is specifically around creating connectivity and restoring some of the old ecological linkages. So we subsequently, I mean, it's been a successful program. You know, we started in 2001 and it carried on for 6 or 7 years, and there was a small gap, and now it started off again. So the basic premise is that we look at restocking, you know, from South Africa and Zimbabwe perspective. We're supporting Mozambique with the restocking of their areas. But we've also now recently started looking at corridors, because that's something I mean, apart from the Signature Peace Corridor, we haven't really looked at these, you know, like CASA's got these wildlife dispersal areas, and I think we can learn a lot from CASA. So we've now essentially started looking at we're busy setting up a task team, and we're about to start an elephant management framework for a landscape level elephant management framework. And so we're looking at elephant management in a broader sense. So we're looking at the societal benefits and a whole range of, you know, scientific benefits, conservation management. But one of the specific focus areas are around looking at establishing these corridors. And because elephants are, you know, generally viewed as a good indicator of corridors, but I do think we need to look at corridors in a broader sense. I mean, obviously the one function is to restore this connectivity and look at connecting and relieving pressure of areas like Honorozo, specifically from elephant management point of view. But we also need to look at issues around beneficiation, creating value from wildlife, looking at building some sort of a wildlife economy, and also more importantly, you know, there's a definite increase in human wildlife conflict in the landscape, you know, both, you know, linked mostly to elephants, but linked to predators as well. And we need to find a way in a meaningful way to address that, you know, both from a human safety and from a food security point of view. And I think we also need to then use this as an opportunity, both from a corridor development point of view, and even in the translocation program, I think there are opportunities to look at a better, or at beneficiation models where we get communities involved and they create, you know, through this program, we create more value in these landscapes to communities living in these landscapes. Because I mean, essentially, I mean, in my mind, that's, you know, looking at landscapes and getting these landscapes more organized and more productive, and getting these corridors established with the benefit to communities, addressing human wildlife conflict. I mean, those are essential factors in terms of the support or the future of the TFCA. And then just finally, what I also want to mention, so we also now, as part of the elephant management framework process, we're looking at having a more structured and a formal approach to translocations. So we're busy, so part of that process, we're going to develop a translocation policy, and the policy will look at things like principles. So in other words, how do you further the objectives of the treaty? And then also look at process issues, look at issues around human wildlife conflict, around benefit sharing, around reporting, because of, you know, once you translocate animals, you know, obviously you need to look at animal welfare and report, looking at aligning census methodologies. So trying to address sort of a whole suite of things around the movement of animals, whether it's through corridors or through active translocations.
Thank you, Pete, for the very, you know, detailed, I think, background, which also sets, you know, good, you know, platform even to have some questions further, even from our, you know, our audience. I will turn it over now to Michael, just to perhaps, you know, have some follow-up questions that we may want from the two experts that we have. Thank you.
Thanks, Edson. So I've picked up a couple of things here in the chat box, which we will come back to. I think I think as Richard pointed out, there's a lot of complexity around issues of governance and institutional arrangements, even when we seem to have structures correct and in place. we find that there's something else that comes into it. I think the other thing that comes out in this is that we are in a changing world. I mean, August last year, July, August last year, none of us were thinking about the possibility of a global pandemic that would shut everything down and that would be in the situation we are. And these, of course, are events that impact upon communities too, and their options under CBNRM. Richard, how do you feel about this issue within these processes of dealing with these change dynamics of all these different things that happen and crop up? Sorry, you're on mute, Richard. Do you want to unmute yourself there?
So, Mike, I will reflect on the income opportunities, perhaps. I think what the current crisis has done is actually become an accelerator to show that perhaps our approach to wildlife economy is actually flawed. And we perhaps have got into a false comfort zone. And if it wasn't for COVID-19, we would have had another crisis come along, and possibly we are going to be expecting a few anyway, which will have a similar impact. And that is the increasing restrictions or challenges of communities to unlock the value of wildlife, in this case, in our case, through the conventional norms of either hunting, which is not popular in Western society, and also tourism. And I'm not sure we'll even get back to the same, certainly in Namibia to this context, to the same type of tourism returns that we had seen up to 2019 even. And the fear around that with tourism is climate change and people's view on long haul flights for pleasure, and whether that's going to come under pressure. And even whether tourism through this pandemic and crisis is going to change. So I think a lot of the income was based on performance of tourism, performance of number of people, or how many wildlife species can be shot. And I don't think that was ever really long-term sustainable. And that I think what this pandemic has forced us to do is reflect on the wildlife economy and to think out of the box and think in other ways. How can we generate an income stream that goes back to pay for conservation efforts, conservation costs that are not dependent necessarily on just increasing the number of tourists in an area and their footprint, or increasing, or the pressure of increasing on the hunting that is needed to cover increased human-wildlife conflict, or increase management, or as we're seeing recently with the increase of commercial poaching, the communities are having to employ more game guards and deploy that. So I see that there are some opportunities with the crisis to reflect over the wildlife economy, which is vast. I mean, there are figures out there of 140 billion worldwide, 240 billion in terms of expenditure. And to reflect on that and think, how can we structure payments back to the custodians, back to the stewards, in a more sustained way than we have become reliant on. And that's just one kind of reflection, Mike.
Great, thanks. I just want to jump quickly to a question that's on the chat, and I want to pick up your experience on Namibia on this. This is from Vince Meyers, who lives in northern South Africa on the Kruger boundary in a community called Bende Mutale. And he's talking here about the importance of introducing many of these concepts right in an early age in the school system. Something that's not happening here in South Africa. Is it happening in Namibia? Is that happening with the conservancies where kids at school are actually learning about these concepts early and not having to catch up later?
No, if we're talking about getting it into curriculum, no. And I think it's, but I entirely agree the importance, because the youth is the future. And often habits that one has die slowly, but with a new generation, they don't have the same habits, and the outlook on conservation, if they can pick this up in the schooling, is, I think, really important. What has happened is efforts to get if I can say it, the science of CBNRM into the universities, and so there is some exposure there, but not in the schooling. And perhaps as a kind of reflection, that I think people too often take for granted the ease of CBNRM. I don't think enough people understand that there is a science behind CBNRM. It's not just about talking to communities. It's not just about having the rhetoric and the wording. It's really understanding the nuts and bolts of these tensions between what is rights, what is responsibilities, who has the authority, scale of management. And I don't think we are sufficiently exposed as a CBNRM family to that. And I don't think that helps us then with ensuring we have robust programs. So yes, I would I think a lot more can be done in bringing this into the schooling system, into the curriculums, and understanding there's more to it than just talking to communities and saying, right, we've done CBNRM.
Right. Thank you. Edson, over to you.
Thanks, Michael. Perhaps I can, follow up with, Pete, just to take, forward the discussion, especially when you look at, communities and the issues of livelihoods. We know that the GOTFCA has developed a livelihood strategy, and how complex is it to move, forward into implementation? But perhaps you may also reflect on the aspects of the youth, how are they involved there, and also issues of capacity, so that we pick it up on experiences from the GOTFCA area. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Edson. There's a number of people on this call that actually worked on the strategy. And I was reflecting on the strategy, or looking at it again, well, I look at it fairly often, but through this times of COVID, I realized actually what a good strategy it is, because the one thing we did get right is that we looked at community development or socioeconomic development in a broader sense. So it wasn't focused only on the wildlife economy. We looked at food security, water security, governance, all those things. So I think we've got a very good strategy. I do think we lack implementation, and I do think we need to basically focus more on implementation, and maybe talk less and implement the strategy. I mean, and any TFCA is the issue around scale. So I still believe that the correct approach and what is happening is this nodal or cluster approach. So the strategy is being processed in various forms by different countries. For instance, in South Africa, it's been sort of the principles and approaches are sort of taken up in a broader, greater Kruger strategic development plan, or strategic development framework. But I, and just reflecting on where we are at, I think we need to implement more. I do think we need to focus on getting these landscapes more productive and look at these interactions between protected areas and areas around them, and how to set up these landscapes so that things don't happen on an ad hoc basis. So not someone funding something here and if some funding there, and there's no interaction or relationship between these. I do think we need to organize these landscapes better, both from a governance perspective, and both from a planning perspective, and both from an implementation perspective, where we have all the different role players playing a part and making it happen. So for instance, you need to get the different spheres of government to invest in providing enabling environment, you get donors to do this, funders to support this, and private sector to bring that together. So I think it needs to be focused on the landscape level and much more structured, which I think it's the general approach, and we're getting there, but to be quite honest, I think we haven't implemented to its that well to date. The other thing I want to mention, just talking about about socioeconomic development is the issue around partnerships, which is absolutely key. I mean, we, you know, partnerships and actually getting the partners, all the partners to work better together and talk more to each other and align efforts better, I think is absolutely key. So that can happen obviously on a TFCA level. So we in the GLTFCA now set up a partners forum where we want to get people to around or provide a platform to encourage dialogue and communication and collaboration around things, and also align to what we're doing with what the different partners are doing and their priorities better. And also similarly doing that in the landscape, because I think although these TFCA processes are driven by conservation agencies, they don't have the capacity often to do the socioeconomic development part of it. And by building good partnerships like the Namibian model, I think you can go a long way towards achieving this. Youth, I mean, yeah, youth is absolutely critical. I mean, we've got a youth program in Mozambique that we had a bit of a delay stop in it. We're trying to resuscitate it, but so we're working with kids in 4 of the Mozambican villages, looking at skills development, using sport as a means. I mean, I know Vince also got a very successful program up in Pafuri. I mean, actually, incidentally, one of the issues that came out of this this program is the issue around influencing the curriculum or having inputs in the curriculum. So you have a longer term approach to it. And I also think the issue around leadership is quite important. I also think we can, especially in the GLTFCA, have a much more structured approach around providing opportunities to build leadership amongst these young people in the TFCA. Yeah, so I mean, that's sort of my take on things.
Thanks, Pete. From the chat box, there is an interesting question. I will ask Professor Mpangwa just to pass on the question. This question is directed to Richard, particularly one from the Namibian experience. Prof. Mpangwa, if you can unmute yourself and ask the question.
Okay, Richard. I know Namibia is a beneficiary of the Green Fund. Is it possible to set up something like that for the wildlife industry, not only in Namibia, but in SADC, for the benefit of in place of the dwindling tourism which you mentioned?
Because I'm not as familiar with the Green Fund in terms of the whether that can be able to replace the loss of income or provide additional income flows for conservation efforts. But we are looking at developing, we are piloting, we are working out how can we generate income flows, whether it's from those kind of facilities such as the Green Fund or others, or Jeff, where payments can be made based on agreed upon performance around wildlife conservation and management of their habitat. We've called it and we branded it here as wildlife credits. But the idea is to try and have a direct link between conservation performance and payments, which currently tourism is a difficult one to do. You can have increased tourism, but wildlife numbers can go down. And it's a bit more easier with the hunting. The more you hunt, the more you get paid. But still, the linkages aren't strong enough necessarily to provide that direct incentive, say, between good conservation and more payments. So we are exploring it. Whether it can be aligned with the Green Fund, I'm not sure.
Thanks, Richard.
Thanks, Prof. Mpangwa. I will hand over to Michael. Whilst doing so, Michael, there is a question from Kevin, and perhaps you can start with that. Thank you.
Yes, absolutely. Kevin, thanks for that question. It's a bit of a tricky question, but I think people have an answer for it. Kevin, why don't you just give us a little background to your question and take it forward if you want to unmute yourself.
Thanks, Mark. Good afternoon, everybody. Yeah, I guess it all boils down to the difficult situation we find ourselves in now with the tourism opportunities coming to an end and our income streams being seriously challenged because of that. And really this need to show the broader value of our TFCA initiatives, and really encouraged to hear from you, Pete, that you've got the strategy. It sounds like a really good strategy, but have you got an understanding of what the livelihood levels are at the moment, and whether or not the strategy has had any positive impact on those livelihoods, notwithstanding the impact of COVID? Is that okay, Mark?
Yeah, it's great. Thanks.
Okay.
Pete, you want to try and tackle that one?
Yeah, I mean, Kevin, that's a very good question. So, so our strategy. So, what we did in the strategy, I mean, when we developed the strategy, we were, we realized that the issue of scale is quite challenging. So, because you move from a TFCA scale to a national scale, and then the next thing you've got a nodal scale that's across national, international boundaries, and then you've got a project scale. So what we did is we divided the TFCA into 9 nodes, essentially. So a lot of these nodes are, for instance, like Vince's Wembley Biosphere Reserve or Kruger to Canyons Reserve. And then some of the other nodes were sort of, we tried to formulate it by working with stakeholders. So, I mean, I think through the strategy, I think one of the main issues objectives that came out of it is that we need to basically have a baseline, because that's the only way you basically measure impact. So some of the areas that we have started working, there was, we did develop a baseline, but I think we're not at the stage of our strategy where we have enough traction in some of the areas where we can actually measure impact. But the idea is that we have, we develop a baseline, and then based on the baseline, you measure basically impact.
Okay. Kevin, any follow up on that?
Thanks for the opportunity, Mike. No, Pete's said it. There is some baseline information, but it's possibly a bit too early at this point in time to see whether or not there's been an impact to any extent. Thanks for the opportunity.
Okay, great. I see that there's quite a few comments here in the chat box. Vince, if you're able to unmute yourself, why don't you pick up with Pete that question on elephants? So you raise an interesting issue of complexity in terms of conservation and livestock management, in that you say that domestic livestock have a major impact on losses for communities. Do you want to pick up on that point, if you can unmute yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Mike. Thanks, everyone, for the opportunity. Just something I observe in the communities that I work with, especially in the Pafuri node of the GLTP. I mean, just yesterday, I was having a conversation with a lady who works with me, and she's had to abandon her little sort of farm by the river because the goats were just raiding it too often. And then also the other day, one of her goats came back with a broken leg because she suspects somebody hit it rather hard with a stone, because it was raiding their veggie garden. And I've noticed throughout the years that people have always, they battle more so with goats, pigs, cows throughout the year. I mean, elephants do come across, and occasionally, maybe 4 or 5 times a year, and take out somebody's larger field. But continuously through the year, people are losing their food security down to the livestock level. And it's probably to do with livestock management, but I'm just wondering if there is any comparative studies done on that. Thank you.
Anyone on the panel want to pick up on that? Aware of anything?
I'm not aware. I mean, it's a fascinating point, and I'm not aware of that, but that will be something that's be really interesting to look at. I don't know if Richard,
anything from Namibia?
So no, I have no studies, but I would like to perhaps share a reflection of many years ago when I was in Mzarabani in Rural District Council, and we had lots and lots of complaints from the farmers with human-wildlife conflict, and particularly the elephants coming into the cash crops. So we did something about it as a council. We got some fencing and electric poles, and we said, right, you put batteries and some tools, and we'll give the wire, I think. It was really interesting. The main people that took advantage of that was those that had the cash crops and the cotton, and they constructed the fence to stop the cattle coming in. And it just told me that the economic impact on their crops was greater from the cattle than actually from the elephants, which was more periodic. It was a problem when they did come, and sure, there's an additional problem of you fear for your life when you're out there. But in terms of the impact on their cash crops, it was a interesting experience, and it showed that actually there were other greater threats to that than just the elephants.
I think when the focus of this discussion today is often looking at this complexity, and one is often somewhat surprised sometimes to find that the complexity reveals itself in different ways. We think about natural resource management and CBNRM, about wildlife and people and policies and programs and projects. But when you get down, as Pete was talking about the importance of scale, when you get down to an individual farmer's scale, what are the issues that affect at that level? And sometimes it's your neighbor's cattle. That's one of the biggest problems. Thank you for that reply. Edson, back to you. Edson, you're still on mute.
Sure. Thanks, Michael, and great insights there. Just to follow up, I see there are a number of comments which may relate to how we can unpack the value in the CBNRM or even in the TFCA initiatives. So I will start with Richard, perhaps, and then Pete may also comment how we can unlock value, especially when we consider the CBNRM projects and also TFCA initiatives that are there, and linking to new nuances that are coming, especially with COVID-19 and the rest.
I think we're going to have to assume that we're going to get to some new normality, and that tourism isn't going to be entirely disappear and will resume. So looking at that, and looking certainly, from my understanding of CASA, that is a large landscape that is particularly looking at tourism in terms of unlocking the value and becoming an economic driver for the local economy and development. The approaches that we have shared and we are pursuing in the Namibian is to provide a partnership structure. We call it joint venture partnerships, where communities through their conservancies provide the landscape and the management of the landscape, and deal with the management of the wildlife and deal with human-wildlife conflict. And they form a partnership with the private sector as operators that bring their skills of building the lodges and bringing the tourists and doing the marketing. We have found that to be quite successful, or relatively successful. But I'm still concerned that is not enough. I'm concerned that first of all, the only kind of payment streams for this wildlife economy, where there's so many supply chains, so many value chains in this economy, it is only those lodges, and often small lodges, that are actually on the ground that are making the payments. And all the way through the chain of that wildlife economy that are generating profits based on a wildlife economy, and a thriving one at that, there are no mechanisms there, no platforms there that can tap into them also paying back to the costs of conservation. So I think there's a disproportional pressure or disproportional dependence on lodges, which is the bottom of the value chain, to make those payments and cover the costs and the pressure that's generated between the landholder, of communities or even the state, and what it goes to pay for conservation. Second, my second concern, and I've lost my thread of thought, so I'll leave it to that. I had a second concern, but I've lost the train.
It'll come back to you. When it comes back, you just jump in and tell us.
It was a very good point, but
yeah, no.
Oh, all right,
Sorry,
thanks,
everybody.
Richard. I'm sure, as we reflect towards the end, you may pick it up, then Pete, from experience, would you, perhaps in just, some few, sentences, how, in the GLTFCA, for example, value is being unlocked in CBNRM or even TFCA initiatives?
Yeah, so I mean, I think obviously the benefits of TFCAs is you can do things at scale. So you can create a lot of connections and connectivity and linkages and access to markets that you won't do in some of the other projects. And also the issue around access, because often if you unlock access on a regional level or on a country-to-country level, that in itself has got a lot of associated benefits. But I do think, I'm just creating value. I mean, I do think we need to look, especially in the post-COVID, looking at getting these landscapes more productive. And I do think we also need to look at issues such as food security and water security, because those are, it's one thing focusing on the wildlife economy, and tourism has always been the sort of our key focus area. But if you look at the Great Limpopo or GLTFCA, I mean, there's over 3 million people living in this landscape. So the chances of creating real benefits from conservation, you can't possibly ever think that you can provide real tangible benefits to everyone. So I think we need to look at the rural economy in a broader sense. So we need to look at food security, we need to look at water security, governance, obviously key. And I still think the way to implement it is through sort of a nodal or cluster approach, where you actually, organize these areas better, from a coordination and investment point of view, and then start looking at the cross-border linkages. I mean, what's also very useful, and it's something we did at the outset of the livelihood strategy, is that we, in this landscape, there's a huge amount of experience and models that work, that you don't have to reinvent. I mean, you can learn a lot from each other, and you can actually take best practice or models that work in the landscape, GLTFCA or in CARS or in a broader region. You can actually, and it's a very useful platform to actually share knowledge and look at these, like Richard was alluding to, what works and what doesn't work, and how you basically learn from as you go forward.
Thanks, Pete. I will turn it over to you, Michael. I think there are some interesting questions in the chat now.
There are indeed. The chat box has been quite lively. We are in the last 4 minutes of our program. I would like to just ask if she's able to unmute herself, Precious, and just expand on your analysis here, which brings in the issue of political economy into the discussion here. Precious, would you mind giving us a little bit of an idea of what you're thinking?
Hello, everybody. Okay. My thinking is that I think a lot of emphasis has been put on the tourism sector in general as a whole, conservation or these transfrontier national parks and areas like that. So there has been a lot of emphasis, especially if I'm looking at the case of Zambia, where you find that the country wants to become a middle income economy by 2030. And when you look at what their policies are, tourism is on the top, you know, it's on the top. And there is this, when we look at the sector as a whole, we are looking at the beauty of travel, the beauty of hospitality. And I don't think people ever expected that we could find ourselves in a situation like this, because there's just a lack of understanding that about the vulnerability of the sector, especially that most of these countries and most of where these the areas where most of these conservation facilities are located, you are looking at poor communities. So a lot of investment has to go into the primary, what you would consider primary sectors in the primary industry in that particular area. What is the primary industry and how can you manage it? But we can see with Africa's development, it's chaos, it's crisis over time. We are sort of trying to jump that primary part and going to tourism, pursuing tourism, which is more of a secondary secondary industry. So we have a lot of, everybody's, especially on top, because most of these projects are top down. So you find that the top is just looking at saying where tourism sort of like it sort of easily attracts capital to it. So everybody is looking at that. But if you look at the sustainability of tourism in the face of something like this, a pandemic, it's not sustainable. So I'm thinking maybe at local level, there should be the issues when we are looking at these issues, what is the political economy of tourism? We need to address that before we look at everything. And so that when we fall, we don't fall so hard. We have something to fall back on, because we are giving up everything, even in these communities, in a drive to push most of these projects through.
Thank you very much, Precious. We're running out of time, and before I turn this over to Edson to close up for us, I just want to pick up a couple of the points that the chat box went absolutely ballistic here at the end. I think there's some fascinating discussions going on, and I hope that the organizers will be able to capture these chats. But I would like to pick up the points that are made by Kevin, by Rod, by Alex, you know, particularly around the issues of disaster risk reduction, resilience thinking. All of these are part of this complexity that we're dealing with when we talk about the concept of TFCAs. And where we talk about Namibia and Botswana and Zimbabwe and Angola and Zambia and the CASA TFCA, we're looking at these huge scales which Pete referred to, and that resilience and complexity is directly linked to those kinds of scales, whether you're working at a micro level and going up to the very large scales. So there's a lot here for us to think on. I'm sorry that we didn't have more time to delve into that particular aspect. I would like to, from my own personal perspective, thank the panelists and thanks to everybody that joined in. But I will turn it over to you, Edson, to close it off for us.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you to our two experts. I think we have had a very, interesting discussion with a lot of perhaps, follow-up issues that I'm sure, the facilitators who, take other webinars may actually tackle. I think just on my end, I would like to just make 3 points, which I think are essential, especially, for the TFCA, team. I think Richard brought in a very important aspect about this issue of scale. I think scale mismatches are very, very common, and it's very necessary that, we look at these even as we address, issues of complexity, because, at a different scale, things may seem well, but once we move and look at the transfrontier, level, scales becomes very, very important, as Peter has actually highlighted, in terms of, biodiversity, corridors, all those things are essential. So scale needs to be looked at in a very, very important aspects: social, ecological, even economic, among the other key elements. The second aspect, I think, which also was on the chart, is the issue about documenting experiences. And I'm sure this is something, as we celebrate all these 20 years of TFCA experiences, let's make attempts to document experience so that we can share with other TFCAs that are perhaps still in the conceptual stages, because it helps to move forward. Then the last part is the issue of implementation of plans. We have development plans, integrated development plans. It could be sustainable livelihoods, frameworks. I think we need to make some efforts to ensure that as we address this complexity that we find TFCAs in various dimensions, how do we ensure that we are able to fully integrate and also implement these elements? So those are some of the key points I picked, but many were shared by our experts, and even Michael brought in some. Perhaps our experts, if we have just, because we are almost over time, just maybe some quick reflections so that we hand over to Clara to close. We will start with Richard.
Mute yourself, Richard. You're on mute.
So thank you very much, Edson, and gives me a chance to just put that final point across that I had, that might, and it's a concern, it's a challenge that I'm going to be putting out there for the TFCAs, that there's a very big challenge to ensure that there's a genuine voice of communities in TFCAs. Now, I'm not talking about structures, I'm talking about the culture. So often in TFCAs, I equate them to globalization. Their need, they have big impact, they have big players. They have big commerce players, they have big political players, they have big conservation players, and having community structures operating in that environment, they often get left behind. And so my worry is that in 20 years' time, in CASA, we might have more elephants, we might have more commerce, we might have more conservation NGOs, but the granaries are still, but there's, i.e. the granaries are full, as one economist once said, and the communities are still hungry. And I worry about that, of how in these TFCAs, one has a balance that ensures that the community structures aren't left behind with the political, economic and conservation elite that have so much more resources.
Thank you, Richard. Pete?
Yeah, mine sort of linked to that. I mean, I think the main challenge in TFCAs is to make it relevant to people, and not, it feels like a lot of times the impression we create through TFCAs is that everything we do for people is to protect wildlife. And I think we need to move away from that and actually genuinely look at development of communities, with or without wildlife. And I think we should change our focus a bit and have a much holistic view on things, and a much more people-centered approach. So that on the one side, and I just want to emphasize also the importance of partnerships, generally speaking. I think partnerships are absolutely key. The more we get people to work together and collaborate and talk and communicate, I think the better it is for everyone.
Thank you very much. Mike, unless you have any comment, if none, thanks so much to our experts and my co-moderator. I will now hand over the word to Clara to close the session. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Edson, for bringing it home for us at the SADC TFCA Network and Steering Committee with some of the important lessons learned from this very interesting discussion. Thank you, Michael, for the moderation as well with Edson, and for our two experts, Richard and Pete, and also to all of you in the chat who've been really sort of making a comeback towards the end with really interesting points that, of course, have been captured and will be noted in our reporting. I would like to just remind you that next week we have another sessions with our 4th week of interactions, which will be about wildlife management, species management, law enforcement, and anti-poaching. So for those of you who are interested, please register on the Zoom link. And then the following deep learning on the Thursday will be on a follow-up issues related always to LEAP strategy. So thank you everybody for your time today. I hope you've enjoyed it. You can watch this again on the Facebook page of the SADC TFCA program, or wait until we get the Zoom recording and then upload it on the SADC TFCA portal. As we close, I would like our panelists and moderators to wave goodbye to everybody. And if you can and want to, unmute yourself and release your video and say goodbye so that we can see your faces as well. Thank you. Bye. Have a good afternoon.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
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 Right.
Bye.
Everybody's too shy.
Oh, no, they're all there.
Bye.
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 Bye, colleagues.
Bye.
Keep
Ciao.
safe.
Bye. 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 Bye, guys.
Bye.
Bye, Tawanda.
See you next week.
Oh, good.
Next week.
Bye, everybody.
See you
Till
soon.
next week.
Bye.
Next week. Cheers, Ditya.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, Professor.
Have a good day. Bye, Sarah. Thank you for joining us.
See you next week. Bye-bye.
See you next week.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, Clara.
Bye, everybody. Have a good afternoon. Thanks again,
Bye.
hey?
Bye.
Thank
Cheers,
you.
guys.
Great.
Thanks for everything. Good afternoon. Thank you.
Bye.